good morning, good afternoon. Wow, somebody thought I was a whole lot taller than I used to be. A couple of weeks ago, I mentioned that in a conversation I'd had with an individual about their church attendance, they were telling me that while at church, they were given this idea, or given this picture, which showed it was like a refrigerator, a microwave, a computer, and asked the question, what do they all have in common? And the answer that the pastor was going for is that they all have an instruction book. And then they showed a picture. This is my understanding as the person was explaining to me. Could be off a little bit. I want you to understand that. Then they showed a picture of a man, people. And what is the difference? And the comment, as I heard it, was, he does not come with an instruction book. He does not come. Now, at the same time, follow that up with, now some people use the Bible as an instruction book, but there isn't an instruction book for mankind. And that just kind of totally blew me away that in church, that a statement, as I understand it, would be made that mankind doesn't come with an instruction book, because I firmly believe that the Bible is the instruction book and the authoritative instruction book from God, inspired by God. So today, what I would like to go through is I'd like to talk about, and I've entitled this sermon, Doctrine and the Christian. Because if we're not careful in our lives will maybe just be a celebration of living, as it were, and living as we want to live, and as we see and understand how we ought to live. Now, I know that God gives us incredible freedom, and we read from the book of Romans where the Apostle Paul, in our scripture reading today in Romans chapter 6, shall we continue to sin because grace abounds? God forbid that we should. That, in other words, we become the slaves to our own ways and our own way of reasoning. So today what we want to do is we're going to take a look at Jesus and doctrine, and we're going to focus on John chapter 7. And we can actually begin here in verse 14 of John chapter 7. It says, not until halfway through the feast did Jesus go up to the temple courts and he began to teach. And the Jews were amazed and asked, well, how did this man get such learning without having studied? Which is a typical question if you haven't been to a university or they hadn't been taught by the rabbi in Jesus' day. And Jesus answered then to that question. He says, my teaching is not my own. Now, in the King James Version, what it says is, my doctrine is not my own. It comes from him who sent me. If anyone chooses to do God's will, he will find out whether my teaching comes from God or whether I speak on my own. He who speaks on his own does so to gain honor for himself, but he who works for the honor of the one whom sent him is a man of truth. There is nothing false about him. And then he goes on and he makes this very bold statement in reference to their understanding of doctrines and teachings, in this case about law. He says, has not Moses given you the law? Yet not one of you keeps the law. I mean, he made no exceptions here. Not one of you keeps the law. Why are you trying to kill me? And of course, then their response to him is, well, you're demon-possessed. You're weird. You're way out there. So this morning, what we want to look at, we want to ask ourselves these questions. What does doctrine have to do with our way of living? It doesn't have anything to do with our way of living. And we want to ask, what does Jesus have to say about doctrine? And can we just make up our own minds when it comes to doctrine? Where do we find doctrine? And are all doctrines good? And how important are they? Well, as we're looking here and we see this word doctrine and teaching interchanged here in the NIV and the King James Version of the Bible, doctrine does mean the teachings. The teachings of in this particular case, the teachings of the church. Or the laws and the rules. We have the Monroe Doctrine. It is the way in which things are to be done, how things are to be handled. And so we want to take a look at doctrine. And we want to take a look at Jesus, first of all, and doctrine. So, what do we find that Jesus says about His doctrine? John chapter 17, going back here now, here's a very, very important point that we need to recognize. Jesus says here, verse 16, "My teaching is not my own." Now, I believe in that is a huge lesson for all of us, is that the teachings of doctrine are not just left up to ourselves. In this case, Jesus said they're not His own. He says it comes from Him who sent me. And it's valuable for us to recognize when we're talking about doctrine that we just don't set up our own form of doctrine, our own ideas, our own belief system by ourselves. Not only did Jesus say that He did not do it, the doctrine that He got came from His Father, came from God, is what He's saying here. And the same point is very important to us as well. And when we're trying to understand what God would want us to do, that we kind of bounce it around through several people to get a good idea, not just our own idea, but most importantly, we have, what does God say? That is where it comes from. So Jesus said it comes from Him who had sent Him. It came from the Father. So again, it would suggest that doctrinal ideas are not about our own. And if it is our own, Jesus goes on to say, now, He says there's a problem with it if it is your own. And because He tells us here, He tells us, if anyone chooses to do God's will, and I believe that doctrine has to do with God's will, Jesus is also telling us here, he will find out whether my teachings come from God or whether I speak on my own. Now, it is again in the practicing of doctrine that we find out whether they are from God. I think we all have had that experience where sometimes it's a little hard to believe or understand certain things, and yet when we begin to practice them, we're given clarity that indeed this is what God is the way God is working in our life. But then he says, now, but if we choose to do it our own way, to establish our own doctrine, this is what Jesus said. He who speaks on his own does so to gain honor for himself. That's a pretty blunt statement. That if you're establishing doctrine, and it is apart from what Jesus tells us, it is apart from what God tells us, then you're doing it to gain honor on your own, is what he's telling us here. But he who works for the honor of the one who sent him is a man of truth, and there is nothing false about him. So this is what Jesus tells us about doctrine, that we can understand. Now, Jesus also tells us, and in order to kind of give us a rounded view of doctrine, we want to take a look at a couple of other statements Jesus makes about doctrine. In John chapter 14 and verse 24, John 14 and verse 24, Jesus says here, he who does not love me will not obey my teachings. We could use the word doctrine. Would not obey my doctrine. So, this is quite a profound statement.
The Worldwide Church of God in Fairfield, Santa Rosa, and Modesto are located in the San Francisco Bay Area, regarded as the most prosperous region in the United States. We believe Jesus Christ when He proclaimed in Matthew 6:24 that serving God is more important than serving mammon. We welcome everyone to come and worship and fellowship every Saturday at the times listed on your screen and on our website, worldwidechurchofgod.com.